now from New York is Dr. Tai-Heng Cheng. He's from Singapore and is a lawyer and international arbitrator. Also with us from New York is Dr. Zheng Wang. He's an associate professor at Seton Hall University. And from Cambridge, Massachusetts, we're joined by Graham Allison. He's a professor at Harvard's Kennedy School and the co-author of Lee Kuan Yew, the Grandmaster's Insights on China, the United States, and the World. Gentlemen, thanks to all of you for joining us. Dr. Zheng, let me start with you. What do you believe is the lasting legacy of Lee Kuan Yew?
Yeah, I think in his long political career, certainly he left a lot of legacies to his country and to Asia and even to the world. But I think one of the major contributions he made is to make Singapore a country from a developing country, from the third world country to the developed country in the first world in one single generation. So this is one of the major contributions. And also the Singapore model has been discussed all over the world and has been, people are trying to compare the current road China is taking is somehow is also, maybe not directly copied from Singapore model, but has, major influence from the, the Lee Kuan Yew's, his political philosophy and the Singapore model.
Graham Allison, you wrote the book on Lee Kuan Yew with your colleague, Robert Blackwell. What were your impressions of him?
Well, he's an extraordinary human being and had an extraordinary life. I would say with respect to legacy, I would underline two things. First, I agree with my colleague. He built a nation. He took a poor port that was at the bottom of the rungs among third world countries, and today Singapore has a higher per capita GDP than the United States. So if that were all that he had done, he would be a memorable figure. But secondly, and I think most people don't appreciate this enough, he was one of the two serious grandmasters of international strategy in his lifetime. And the only other one that I've ever known or read is Henry Kissinger. He could see the future. He could see opportunities in the future. And for that reason, I think there's no question that of people outside of China, no one had a greater impact on China's rise than Lee Kuan Yew, and actually outside the U.S., no one had a greater impact on U.S. policy towards China than Lee Kuan Yew, who was a counselor to Nixon and Kissinger in the opening to China and to every president since, including Obama with the pivot.
Dr. Tai-Heng, you are from Singapore. You grew up in Singapore. What was it like growing up under Lee Kuan Yew?
Well, in many ways, growing up in those days is not so different than, say, suburban America. It was, to a suburban American, remarkably normal. Two parents go to work, they come home in the evening, have dinner with their children, watch television, the children study, go to sleep, and go to school the next day.
Dr. Zheng, in New York again, the relationship with China was not always good. In fact, at one time, China referred to Lee Kuan Yew as, and I'm quoting here, the running dog of the West. But that changed in 1978. Deng Xiaoping went to Singapore to meet with Lee Kuan Yew. How and why did the Chinese view change?
Yeah, this is Deng Xiaoping's visit to Singapore in 1978 was indeed a very important visit. And actually, if we look back to 1978, Deng Xiaoping actually also visited several other countries, including Japan. It was such a critical occasion that Deng Xiaoping, before he started opening up and reform policy, he tried to visit several countries, especially to trying to learn, trying to decide what kind of path China choose to go. And this visit, actually his conversation with Lee Kuan Yew, and including a lot of details between two of them, has been widely reported, analyzed, discussed in China. And I think he learned quite a lot from Lee Kuan Yew during that trip, especially what he saw in Singapore gave him first a kind of like he realized that China is far behind to the rest of the world, including some of the Asian neighbors. But at the same time, it also gave him confidence. Because especially Lee Kuan Yew told him, he said, you have to trust your people. You got the most talented people in the world. And if you release their potential, China will, definitely will surpass Singapore. So Deng Xiaoping was during that trip, and he was also impressed about the way, Singapore handling of foreign investment, trade, and free market. So, and also I think believe that trip changed his ideas about Singapore a lot, and also he somehow being very interested in the, the model of Singapore. And you can say in the later on years of China's opening up and reform, and many of the policies he, pursued is somehow, we can say some of the, exactly as Lee Kuan Yew has did in Singapore. Like, for example, several things that may, it's played a very important role in Singapore's success, like the political stability, social order, and a clean and efficient government. I think that's also the several things Deng Xiaoping did after he, started his reform and opening up policy.
All right, Graham Allison, if we look back at that short history of the relationship between China and Singapore, how much of a turning point was that visit by Deng Xiaoping to Singapore? Because it seems a very unlikely scenario where you get a small city-state that had so much influence on a big country like China.
It is a great puzzle, but as Deng Xiaoping himself said, he turned to Lee Kuan Yew, and he called him his mentor. And if you look at Ezra Vogel's magnificent biography of Deng Xiaoping, he gives a very interesting discussion of the ways in which basically Deng Xiaoping, having decided that the Chinese model was failing, looked around for success stories, and as was just said, looked to Singapore as a model because he was particularly impressed that Chinese seemed to be doing it. And I remember on one of the occasions I was talking to Lee Kuan Yew, and I asked him about this experience of the trip in 1978, and he said that Deng Xiaoping had thought that maybe only Europeans and Americans were capable of managing market economies that became first world countries. So he was particularly impressed that here was a Chinese ethnic, Lee Kuan Yew, and a majority Chinese ethnic population that seemed to have discovered this, as Lee Kuan Yew called it, a magic black box. And Lee Kuan Yew explained to him that the magic of the market was actually quite simple. It had to do with private ownership, it had to do with free markets, it had to do with allowing people to express their own creativity and their own initiative in building an economy, and that there was no reason China couldn't do this itself. And I think then Deng Xiaoping decided to set China on a fast march to the market. And in the period after that, as was just said, Deng Xiaoping and each one of his successors, every one of them is actually called Lee Kuan Yew mentor because they've continued coming back to the Singapore model and to Lee Kuan Yew's own experience as they try to think about managing a much larger and much more complicated situation in China.
Dr. Tai-Heng, Lee Kuan Yew may have embraced free markets, but he certainly did not embrace any kind of political dissent or political opposition. In fact, many called him a dictator, and the New York Times referred to him as the world's favorite dictator. Yet he was loved by his people. How do you explain that contradiction?
Well, your question presupposes, of course, in using loaded words like dictator, that's in fact how he was perceived. There was an article that just came out in the Independent newspaper in England just a few days ago by a Singaporean describing the freedoms that Singaporeans enjoyed under his rule and continue to enjoy: the freedom from crime, the freedom for their children to be able to run the streets safe at night, the freedom for women to take buses home in the evenings. And so in the sense of voicing opposition certainly was different than in the United Kingdom or in America, but there were many other freedoms which were enjoyed back then. And I think by understanding that, one can appreciate better the love and outpouring that Singaporeans had for Lee Kuan Yew and have shown in this period of mourning.
We are going to take a break right now. We'll continue our discussion about Lee Kuan Yew's influence in China. Stay with us, you're watching The Heat.